I know it's beautiful.
Beautiful. Yeah, especially this time of year.
We're going to
Not
give
so
it just
much
a
in
minute.
winter.
Oh, yeah. This is the time of year to be probably leaving where I am. It's pretty hot over here, but excited to see the topic. If there's anybody else out there, you want to let us know where you're coming in from. Love to see where people are in the world. We'll give it just a minute because it doesn't always dump everybody in at the same time. So make sure everybody gets a chance to join. And yes, Jennifer, you're absolutely right. It's hot right now. It's humid too. Is this anybody's first Greenlight Guru event? I'd love to see that if this is your first time coming to one of our events. Or if you know the number. I think I saw 40 once. Someone had come to 40 different webinars, which I thought, I'm still working on getting my team to figure out what kind of prize we can give people, but awesome, Michael. Glad you're here with us. It's your first time. Lithuania, very cool. Welcome. And I'm just gonna apologize up front if I mess anybody's name up. I try to use people's names, but I don't always get the correct pronunciation. So my mom tells me I don't even say my own name correctly. So work with me on that and give me a little grace there. But I think it's about time. So hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's webinar is Compassion and Compliance in the Conduct of Clinical Research. My name is Etienne Nichols. I'll be the moderator for today's session. And just a few housekeeping items before we get going too far. First, obviously, we want you to actively participate. So use the chat tab on the right to connect with fellow attendees. And to kind of make your comments on the presentation, always remember to play nice though. The Q&A on the top right, if you see that little tab up there, it says Q&A, that's where you can ask questions that we will ask during the Q&A session at the very end. Those are the questions that I'll ask Megan to get those specific answers. So even if you don't have a question yourself, go over and navigate to that Q&A and see if anybody else has a question that's relevant to you, and you can upvote those questions. We'll try to prioritize the ones that are most upvoted. We will be sending out the full recording and the presentation slides to all the registrants after the live event, so watch your inbox for that follow-up email that should be coming in a few days after the event. I'd like to say a few things about Greenlight Guru. At Greenlight Guru, our mission is to improve the quality of life through our work in the medical device industry, which is likely a shared goal of many of you here today. We host these free webinars to share valuable insights, learn from top industry experts, and showcase our industry-leading solutions. Our software is designed to help medical device companies bring life-changing products to patients faster, more efficiently, and with less risk. Our software suite includes solutions for product development, quality management, and clinical data management, all tailored specifically for the medical device industry. So if you're interested in joining over 1,000 medical device companies that trust Greenlight Guru, visit www.greenlight.guru for your personalized demo after today's webinar. I'll let you go ahead and start sharing your slides, Megan, and get that going. But I'd like to introduce Megan Lombardi very quickly here. Megan Lombardi is a clinical and regulatory affairs expert with 10 plus years of experience bringing novel medical devices, diagnostics, and drug device products to market. She specializes in clinical trial design, FDA submissions, and regulatory strategy across 510K, IDE, PMA, IND, and breakthrough programs. She holds a master's of translational medicine from UCSF and UC Berkeley and a bachelor's in biomedical engineering from Johns Hopkins. If I got that right, Megan, and you're gonna have to correct me if I mess anything up here, because but Megan
You
began her
got it.
career, she began her career developing low-cost devices for global health, then moved into engineering roles at early-stage medtech startups before transitioning to clinical and regulatory leadership. And since 2018, she's worked as a consultant advising startups and established companies of regulatory submissions, trial execution, and medical writing. Now she's the VP of Clinical and Regulatory Affairs at Nilo Medical Consulting Group, and she combines deep technical expertise with hands-on experience across CROs, industry, and academia, helping innovators turn complex science into actionable strategy. And you can fill in the gaps, Megan. Let me know if I got anything wrong. Glad to have you.
That was great, Etienne. Thank you so much for the introduction. I apologize to the audience in advance. I'm on the back end of a cold, so if I'm scratchy, I apologize for that. But very happy to be with everybody this morning and talk to you a little bit about some topics that I am passionate about and some learnings that I've had over the years that I'm hoping will be actionable for you all as you proceed into the clinical phase of development for the products you're working on. So as mentioned, my intention this morning is to really give you all a toolbox for running both a compassionate and a compliant clinical trial. And what I'd like to sell all of you on this morning is that not only is compassion important as a human being, but it actually renders enhanced data integrity and enhanced compliance as you conduct your clinical trial. So we're going to talk about, before the study even begins, what considerations can we take into account, including protocol development and logistics for the study. Then we'll talk moving forward chronologically in the clinical research toward regulator interactions. So as you speak with the FDA and IRB about your study, how can we account for compassionate or empathic interactions in those contexts? And then moving forward into the actual execution of the study, what does this look like? Etienne did a great job introducing me, so I won't spend a lot of time here. Largely just wanted to share that I have been on all sides of clinical research, from the site on the academic side, the sponsor, as well as now the CRO side of research. So I bring the perspectives of all of those. Definitely not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but this is some of the different medical disciplines I have done clinical research in, just to say that my ethos comes from a broad range of contexts. So when I say compassion in clinical research, you might be wondering, compassion for whom? And what might come to mind is compassion for the research subjects themselves. But I want to set the stage for you all that this is much more broad than compassion for just the research subjects, but also for study teams at large. And that includes the research site, as well as the sponsor, the PI, all parties. And we'll talk shortly about what this looks like in terms of all the different players, but there's compassion and empathy that we can consider across a lot of different individuals in the spectrum of the trial. And then, as the title suggests, what we're talking about and the thesis that I'd like to pose is that compassion is actually to the benefit of the compliance and the data integrity as you conduct the study. So you might not think of relationships as a primary element in a clinical trial, but this is one version of the complex web of individuals who are involved to make clinical research happen. And each one of these bubbles represents a type of person, but obviously in a lot of studies, some of these can represent dozens, hundreds, or thousands of individuals, and they all have distinct relationships with one another that are necessary in order to conduct our research. You're probably all familiar with the word empathy, but just as a reminder, empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. And empathy sounds like a really soft concept to bring into something that's scientific and rigorous, but I think if you come along with me on the journey, you'll see why empathy and what's seemingly a soft concept can actually add rigor to the way we conduct our research. The concept of empathy comes in for a number of different elements of the study, but ethics, of course, is one of them. We want to maintain the rights and safety, the welfare of our research participants. It also comes in when we think about recruiting research, because understanding and sharing the feelings conceptually of those who are considering participation in research may help us to increase engagement of our participants and may ultimately help us to reduce the attrition or the dropout rate as we conduct our studies. And then finally, regulators are people too. So as we speak with individuals from the FDA or individuals from the IRB, recalling that these are people too, and having a human-centered approach can potentially lead to better collaboration and communication. So reminder, of course, that we're talking about science, we're talking about research, but we are also touching patients' lives when we conduct clinical trials. Some people in that web we spoke about touch patients' lives more directly than others, but ultimately across that entire web, decisions that each one of those individuals make does have major implications for those who conduct and participate in trials. And so what I would call for is intention from start to finish and attention to those decisions as you proceed through designing your trial and executing the trial to assist and offer empathy toward the subjects and staff who are involved. And we will get into what that looks like as we advance here. As mentioned, I argue that empathy is not a soft skill in this context because it improves our ethics, integrity, and helps to build a stronger team. So I wanted to move to the first poll here. I'm curious who's in the audience because I think we can add some better examples depending on who is participating. So Etienne, would you mind putting up the first poll for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So you may need to navigate to the poll tab. It's up there next to the chat and Q&A, should be between those. So if those of you listening, if you're able to find that, it should be open now. We'll just leave it open for just a minute or so, maybe 30 seconds. If you're able to, yeah, go ahead.
Looks like a lot of sponsor staff and CRO staff mostly.
Yeah. I'll just leave that open for just a little bit longer, but yeah, if you're able to see the results, yep, looks like smaller percentage of, yeah, mostly sponsor staff, and then yeah, second place would be CRO staff.
Okay.
Cool.
That's great because the first part of this is going to be super applicable to the sponsor staff, which is thinking about designing the study from square one. So I'm going to move forward to talk to you all about some ideas in study design. So from the very beginning, as you're envisioning the research, the endpoints that you're interested in collecting, the population, the better you design the study from the beginning, the faster it will enroll, the lower dropout rate or attrition that you'll see, and it will produce more reliable data. And these are some of the elements of the study design that I'd like to speak about in terms of how we can consider those from the beginning and make better decisions there. First of these is the eligibility criteria and the study population. So this is a concept that some might be familiar with, that the more diverse the study population is, the more generalizable the results will be. So reducing the kind of niche elements of the eligibility criteria allows you to enroll a more broad population, which means that the results of the trial will be more representative of how this product will work when it actually goes to market, which of course there's benefits there. There's more benefits of having more broad eligibility criteria because this allows us to enroll more quickly because we exclude fewer individuals. Next piece I'd like to mention is that including underrepresented groups allows us to first give fair access to research benefits, but also, as mentioned, to generate representative data for how the device or the drug biologic will function post-market. Notes that you could consider specifically on eligibility criteria are potentially comorbidities and how comorbidities might be limiting if you include or exclude more or fewer comorbidities, and then also having mandatory visits as you develop your protocol during standard work hours. Certain populations may not be able to participate in the study, but there's something to say for well thought out eligibility criteria because we want to balance the medical complexity of the population we're enrolling with the quality of the data that we'll be collecting. And so that's to say, if there are a lot of confounding variables that might be present in the population we're enrolling, it could become difficult to really determine the influence of the intervention we're studying. So I do strongly encourage that the eligibility criteria are well thought out, and we do want exclusion criteria that are appropriate, but it's a balance of not having such a limited population that we restrict possible enrollment and restrict a diverse study population. Next piece to think about as we go through study design is the patient population we're working in. There are special considerations of a lot of different populations that we might be thinking about, and I listed some examples here. So if we're studying our technology in babies or in children, we might have to be mindful of the duration of time we're asking of them to participate in research interactions or visits. We might need to think about painful procedures we're exposing them to, or the volume of blood that we're drawing. For people who have potentially mental health concerns in our clinical trial, especially studies of, depression, bipolar, the inherent to the patient population, they may have challenges or just lack of interest in returning to the clinic for study visits. And so this is a unique kind of condition of the patient population that would suggest we should have a smart study design that can accommodate the participants we intend to enroll. Likewise, for transportation, it's common that the study population we'd like to enroll may have limited mobility or transportation challenges. This is something that it benefits the study to think about those in advance. It's empathetic toward our patients to consider how we might get them to clinic or get them their follow-ups, but it's also logistically important so that we're sure to follow through on the visits and the scheduling that we've committed to in the protocol. And then another kind of broad consideration is socioeconomic status and what it takes for participants to enroll and move through the study procedures. So talking about the burden on our study subjects for participation in the study, there are some ideas that you can consider to make it easier for participants. And again, this is an empathic consideration, but I would also argue that accommodating participants will encourage protocol compliance and research integrity as you set up the study to enable them the access they need to get the follow-ups and the evaluations completed. Some ideas would be to set up satellite sites so that patients don't have to travel as far in order to complete their follow-ups. You could hire off-hour staff so that you can provide after hours or weekend visits for participants. You could also consider having wider visit windows so that people can have more say in when they come. And then there's also mobile phlebotomy, which is a newer, at least in the studies that I run, a newer consideration that can be made available so that blood draws can occur in folks' homes. And then a big topic that I'll continue talking about as we proceed is the nice to have versus the need to have data. There's a lot of information that might be really interesting, but really doesn't assist in the research aims. And the more of those that get stacked in a clinical protocol, the more difficult it is to run the study. And you might end up compromising the important data because you've added so much information that really wasn't necessary. So keeping the study streamlined to research aims is important. A few more ideas on ways to accommodate subjects and eliminate or reduce the frequency of travel time and clinic visits are home health. There's home health nursing and per diem nursing that you could consider so folks can stay at home. This assists with populations who are immunocompromised, who are hesitant to come to clinic, and those who have mobility and transport challenges. I'm sure a lot of you, especially post-pandemic, have learned to incorporate Zoom calls and telemedicine into your clinical trials. This is one good thing that came of our quarantine situation in 2020 was that we've all learned how to be creative and execute a lot of the research requirements remotely. So leveraging telemedicine is a good idea to assist in not only the challenge for research patients, but also for the PIs who are busy to be able to do these calls in a more convenient fashion. Likewise for phone calls. And then finally, that concept of remote labs and being able to do those in potentially send out or satellite laboratories. I flag here the endpoint consideration because for your endpoints that are driven by laboratory values, you do really want to maintain consistency of how those are analyzed. So using different locations for labs that contribute to endpoint is not as wise as you'd like to centralize those data. All right, Etienne, I'm going to ask for the next poll, which is who has had protocol deviations because data intended to be collected were not standard of care. I'm curious if you guys have seen this before.
All right, that should be open. So if you're able to navigate to that polls tab so you can answer, let's love to see that. Looks like we've got a few that who say yes often. So
yeah, I see that too. And maybe for those who are first timers who've not run studies before, you can claim there are no deviations on the studies you work on. And then once you get into your first study, you can answer differently. That one's
Looks like the
mostly in
majority
jest.
just say it's happened before. At least, yeah, maybe the majority is not often, at least. So that's good.
Yeah. Okay. So I would say that this does definitely happen frequently moving forward here. Um, Sometimes sites are kind of stuck in a rut and they do the labs and the follow-ups that are standard of care, and the protocol that we're implementing may have a lot of different things that we're interested in the context of research, and we end up finding later that there are deviations in the study because, well, that wasn't standard of care, so we didn't collect it, type of thing. um, so wanted to speak to that a little bit because this is something that I see. First comment here is if it's not standard of care in your protocol, that's okay. That's expected because we're doing research here. It's investigational. There might be signals that we want to look for in terms of either safety or efficacy on the intervention that wouldn't be part of standard of care and are important to implement in the context of the research. So first off, this is okay to implement in the protocol and encouraged and necessary oftentimes. Um, but it's when we stack many non-standard of care investigational elements in follow-up that aren't to the benefit of the safety or analysis of efficacy that protocols become really cumbersome and confusing for sites to implement. So what I would encourage is to scrutinize each visit and to consider the data with your key opinion leaders or your PIs that's actually meaningful information. So at the end of kind of the wish list and throwing it all onto the protocol about the information and the endpoints that you're interested in, I would re-review the protocol with another lens, which is which of these are kind of interesting, maybe nice to have, but not super meaningful. And then what's the burden of all that extra data on your study teams and your research participants? Because if there's a lot of burden and little value to some of those metrics that might be interesting, I would consider taking some of those out so that the data that's collected is more streamlined. Because if you're going to have some deviations across the board for a really complex study, it's better to reduce the complexity and reduce the deviation so that you have a more comprehensive data set for the data that are actually meaningful for the intervention. And one consideration you can think about here is whether there might be certain elements of follow-up that are applicable to some but not all participants. This wouldn't be endpoints. Of course, we want to analyze our endpoints in everyone, but unless there's a smart design there. But you might want to think about having if-then scenarios in your protocols so that this doesn't become overly burdensome for everybody when it's only necessary in a handful of folks. And I'll give you guys ideas about that momentarily. So investigational means non-standard of care data is okay and expected, but it should be intentional what is included in the protocol. So next consideration for your study protocol is an if and then scenario. And for those who are newer to clinical trials, I'll just introduce this concept that once you have a study protocol, if you deviate from that, it's a documentation exercise to note all of the ways in which that protocol was not executed as it was written. And so if we can anticipate moments where the protocol is really not appropriate or ideal in certain situations, we can bake in the if and then scenarios into the protocol to prevent there being a huge documentation effort and also a large number of protocol deviations, because we've accounted for those kind of if and then scenarios is what I'm calling them, which means if this condition is true, then this follow through is required by the protocol. And then if a certain population or a certain condition would warrant that certain data aren't necessary, that won't be a deviation anymore because it's been written as such in the study protocol. So a few considerations for implementing this concept is if it's an endpoint, you probably do need all of the data. I see endpoints sometimes that are specific to a subset of the population for whom conditions are true. So this is an option there, but just keep in mind that for the most part, you want to collect a comprehensive data set for endpoints. But if it's not an endpoint, maybe there's a safety signal that you're looking for. Potentially there's a trigger that then would dictate subsequent follow through on that safety analysis. So maybe one lab is a certain percentage off from normal. And if that condition were true, then the following additional 6 labs would be collected or something like this. This allows us to reduce complexity of visits where there might otherwise be a lot of follow-ups or labs or evaluations conducted. It also, back to the concept of our compassion for our research subjects, allows them to go through fewer blood draws or fewer analyses when they're not necessary. And a couple more examples here are to potentially collect INR in patients who are on warfarin, but not for the remainder of the population, or to repeat liver enzymes, but only when a data monitoring committee believes that's necessary. Okay, already on to our next poll, which is, have you ever gotten a couple participants into your study and then realized this protocol is going to be impossible to comply with? That's something that you guys see?
I think you stopped sharing, but I have that poll up. So looks like, wow, they all came in at the same time and it's split right down the middle. 30, 30, 30.
Okay.
But a couple haven't experienced, but it could be that, I don't know if that's indicated in indexing from people who haven't done one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Has happened before though, looks majority.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go back to the slides.
Yep, I see him.
So the kind of follow through from that concept is for those who do experience this, or for those who are planning your study, is another lens when your protocol has been developed is to walk through those study visits. And I'm guilty of this too. The first time I'm writing a protocol, I'm thinking about the endpoints, I'm thinking about what we need to learn about the product that we are evaluating, and then the logistics of everything that we're calling for may not be the first thing that comes to mind on the initial draft of the protocol. So this extra lens is walk through each visit, and maybe walk through the visit among a colleague or among the team who's involved to think about, what is the duration of that visit look like? What's the workflow look like? How many different individuals are involved from the hospital? How many different locations at the research site need to be accessed? What are the different materials required? How far will people need to travel to get there? And what does it look like when they get there? And I don't know about some of the attendees, but there can be really long study visits, and people might not think about, when are study subjects going to eat, or where are we going to put them, because they're going to fill rooms for an entire day at a time. So thinking about those logistics in advance can, one, help you to potentially alter what the visit looks like in order to make it more feasible for the study team to conduct, but secondarily can help you with budgeting, and also can help you on implementation to properly train study staff for what you actually envision needs to be done in order to execute those visits successfully. And I have an example here from a study that I worked on a few years back, where when we added it all together, one of the study visits required 16 hours in a single visit. And it turned out that all of those were necessary. We had PKs, which obviously required blood draws over an extended number of hours, and a lot of different labs and analyses that needed to be conducted. But knowing that in advance allowed us to plan for an overnight. We provided funding for a hotel room for participants. We had transportation arranged, and it took walking through that visit and what it looks like in order to identify what was actually necessary to make it happen successfully. So I'm going to move forward from study design and protocol writing to regulator interactions. First, we'll talk about the FDA. So I mentioned early on that people who work at the FDA are humans, and there is an opportunity in these dialogues to humanize the process, which means putting reviewers in participants' shoes. The logistics that might be called for some of the elements of a study that FDA encourages may not be possible, or may be extremely challenging for study subjects. So our ability to walk through what that study visit will look like and walk through the logistics and resources that are necessary can then help us convey that to the FDA reviewer and hopefully allow for more effective engagement by talking in practical terms about what's possible for executing that study. I have some examples here. These are all real examples from studies that I've worked on. If the patients, especially studies in children or populations that have unique considerations, if the ask in the protocol is impossible or extremely challenging, the quality of the data will be compromised because we won't be able to collect. Patients will refuse or they'll drop out because the study is unpleasant or challenging to comply with. And granted, sometimes that's necessary, but in the cases where we can put ourselves in participants' shoes and bring our reviewers along on that journey, it can help us to design a study together with the FDA that can successfully be implemented and concluded. So quick story time. These are both endpoints that I have worked through on previous studies with FDA and had dialogues with them. And this is to say that it's not always successful to do this, but it can be. My first example was an endpoint that required a punch biopsy in very young children on a frequent basis. And we as a study team had feedback from parent representatives of children with this condition, as well as our PIs and the sponsor themselves, all were against having punch biopsies in these young children. It's extremely painful for them and miserable for parents to put their children through that on a quarterly basis. And we brought that to the FDA. We explained to them what this endpoint takes to collect and the punch biopsies, and they ultimately agreed with us, and we went with a different proxy for the same concept. So this is a success moment where our reviewers did agree with us on the rationale. It's not always like that. Sometimes there's an endpoint that's really important and we don't have success even in presenting some of the logistical challenges. So another story is an endpoint that required fasted labs in children who have continuous feeding tubes, which is, if you think about it, nearly impossible because they can't disconnect the feeding tubes. It's impossible to fast a subset of the population in that study, and ultimately we took deviations for a large number of participants and had to maintain the endpoint that was being requested. So it's not always successful, but it can be, and it does ultimately yield a more feasible study as long as you're still getting the data that you require to evaluate the intervention. So my comment here is not to change something that's foundational in order to assess your investigational device or product, but to attempt to run a study that doesn't require something that will ultimately be a lot of protocol deviations. So put your reviewers in the participant's shoes or in the research team's shoes, and hopefully together you can conclude upon endpoints and assessments that are feasible. So another comment here, which we spoke about a little bit at the beginning, is that the broader population we study, the more representative the data from that trial will be when you go to market. And this is kind of ebbs and flows in importance depending on the perspective of the FDA. Prior to the current administration, there was a lot of emphasis on health equity initiatives at the FDA and movement toward looking for more diverse populations in clinical research. The FDA has backed down on some of that in the last 6 months or so. However, ultimately, the data that's produced by a trial is going to be more meaningful and more representative of how a product will work, regardless of the requirements from the FDA to do this. So thinking about how to make participation in a study less burdensome for all potential individuals who might consider participating in this study ultimately has benefits to enrollment rate, reducing dropout in the study, and then creating a representative data set. Now I'm going to move on to the IRB, the second layer of regulator interactions. And most of the advice for the IRB is similar to the FDA. It's speaking with the panel on the board in practical terms and as humans, to put them in participants' shoes and put them in the shoes of the study teams conducting the protocol. I would say with the IRB that you really won't know their take until you try. So talking them through what would make the study practical to run and putting proposals out there, they may accept what you have in mind, even if you're hesitant and feel that they may not. And I have a couple of examples here. So first example is that in one particular study I worked on, we had the IRB approve $2,000 of funding per visit for a 9-visit study for participants, which sounds like a ton of money, but ultimately was necessary for what we were doing in that study. So we all were kind of hesitant to put such a large number, but we justified why it was necessary, and the IRB did ultimately approve that. Another one that we tried and were successful with is mailing kits to participants' homes. These were kits for one of the functions in the follow-up that participants we believed could do themselves, but we weren't certain that the IRB would agree with us, and they ultimately did. So I would always try and see what the IRB will agree to and work with them to make the study something that is practical to execute. And then last one here, which is true for both the FDA and IRB reviewers, is pick up the phone and talk to them. If there's feedback that you receive that's written that doesn't make sense or you don't agree with, talk to the member on the board who created that conclusion or who can speak to that conclusion and figure out a middle ground that will work. And I won't always say that a middle ground can be found, but it's worth speaking as humans to figure out how you can work through some of the impasses that might have come from the review. And then a couple other concepts for IRB interactions. Another one is to bake concessions into the protocol, which is harkening back to that if and then scenario. So for example, if a particular condition were true, then a study visit can be conducted over the phone. Or if another particular condition might be true, then maybe they can have their study drug mailed to them rather than having to come to clinic to pick it up. So if you bake in those concessions to the protocol, you'll reduce the number of deviations that you might encounter as you execute this study. A lot of times sponsors won't prefer, and for the sponsors in the audience, I know it's tough to think about some of the compromises where the study won't be executed to a T, but you can bake it into the protocol that this concession must be approved by the sponsor in writing each time it occurs. And then you as the sponsor have an opportunity to, on a case-by-case basis, review if and when you're okay with some of those alternative options being implemented. So again, I think if-then scenarios, if not done in a wise fashion, could yield a haphazard study, but the recommendation is really to think through the logistics in advance and make smart choices about places where we can anticipate this won't be possible, and then write that in and account for it so that study teams across multiple sites can implement consistently. And so we're not deviating from the plan, but rather implementing the plan as it was intended. Next question for the polls is, I'm wondering how many of you at this point use e-consent and how many of you use phone consent regularly? And maybe for those who are first-time research, you won't have a good answer here, and we can talk about what these look like. But Etienne, I'm curious about how frequently people are using e-consent and phone consent at this point in time.
All right, so the poll is open. Looks like about some use e-consent, some use both. There's probably about 30% don't use either at the moment. Coming in a little bit more. Phone consent alone seems to be kind of not popular.
A rare one, yeah. Yeah, which is rare for me as well. Okay, so wanted to talk a little bit about these. E-consent is obviously newer, and a lot of the EDCs at this point are offering e-consent options. For those who don't use it yet, or for those who are using it but tenuous about where it's appropriate, one concept, of course, is that decentralized trials are becoming more and more prevalent, and e-consent is in almost all cases necessary for a decentralized trial. But another thing to think about is whether the study population is tech capable. So if your enrollment population is expected to be advanced age or have limited dexterity, then maybe e-consent isn't the best choice. But on the other hand, e-consent can be very fast. It allows us to access people remotely and get them consented in a streamlined fashion. So e-consent has a really good place in research and can be a good idea, but I have had situations where when the population is not tech capable, it causes more harm than good because the research population is really not compatible with the complexity of the tech interface. So I would say think about this one in advance and implement where it does make sense. The fact that none of you use phone consent alone, at least, is not surprising. I think it's pretty few and far between where phone consent is permissible. This did come up for me a few times during the pandemic when phone consent was necessary, and typically subsequent to phone consent, additional written approvals are necessary, and or third-party observers would have to give written documentation of what had occurred on the phone. But another thing to think about is inventive recruitment methods, which is related to e-consent and opportunities that arise when we are conducting elements of the research remotely, is that we can recruit online. And there's a lot of businesses who've come up over the years that assist in inventive methods for recruitment. And I would say, as it pertains to the IRB and the FDA, making them aware of your intentions for recruitment and consenting procedures in advance will ensure that the regulators and sponsor are aligned in how recruitment would be conducted. But there's some really interesting and inventive ways to do recruitment of late that would be a consideration to assist in enrollment rate and allow us to reach populations that might not be as overtly accessible on a face-to-face basis. Okay, so now I'm going to flip forward to ideas for the actual execution of the study. And I want to just highlight the concept that there is empathy in study leadership. All of those who have participated in clinical trials in the past can probably attest that there is stress involved. Oftentimes there's deadlines, there are expectations for enrollment rates and first patient in, last patient, with timelines and goals that may be really difficult to adhere to. And outside of the deadlines dictated by the sponsor or by the sites themselves, there's also strain entailed with research site staff and the bonds that they form with participants. In some cases, what we're studying might be a really complex or challenging condition, and research participants have really troubled experience throughout because of their condition. And in other cases, just being a part of a clinical study is potentially confusing and difficult for folks, and the bonds that form between staff and participants can make some of what should be a black and white concept kind of become gray because there's an emotional bond that forms and a personal relationship that forms between study staff and the subjects. So we'll talk about some strategies there. But outside of the site to participant relationship, there are a lot of other team dynamics that come in, and it can be really difficult and straining if they're not managed well. So empathy and leadership is important. And just reminding now as we advance toward considerations of conducting the study, this web of relationships comes up again, and thinking about now these relationships as we proceed through what they look like as we conduct the study. So for those who are research coordinators on the call, if there are any, I want to speak to some of the experiences you have. But even if you're not a research coordinator, decisions that sponsors make and that CROs make have huge impact on study coordinators, which is the staff member or the staff members at a site who are really implementing the research. The PI is kind of the name behind and the oversight of the study, but the coordinators are the hands and feet of execution of the study. and they do form oftentimes bonds with participants that can become stressful. And they also may have to emotionally support participants through the uncertainties or the experience of the study. I would say that it happens fairly often that this emotional bond between coordinators and participants can add complexity to the study. There's a tendency to compromise potentially elements of the protocol because of the empathic sentiments toward a research participant. There may be an instinct to prolong when participants are coming in for visits, or to allow them to forego certain things because of that compassionate relationship between the coordinator and the research participant. And I would actually call for, which maybe sounds contradictory to the title of the talk, but I would call for the maintenance of professional boundaries between coordinators and research subjects, which sounds like a really difficult thing to say inherent to the relationship they have, but ultimately it's more empathic toward the population at large who suffer from a given disease we're studying to execute research with integrity and ultimately develop data that are meaningful for that population. And so taking a step back, adhering to the protocol is actually the best thing we can do for research participants who are optimistic for future commercial availability of a product. The more we compromise on execution of a study, the more we compromise the potential ultimate market adoption or market approval of the product we're studying. So I would recommend maintaining professional boundaries, even though it's difficult, and I will give you guys some tools and ideas on how that can be done. I think this is the second to last poll and might not be super applicable for the group we have at this talk, but I'm wondering about strategies that you all might use to balance the integrity of the actual study conduct with a compassionate experience, especially if there's any research coordinators in the room. You guys might have some ideas on ways that you can balance these things. And I'll speak to some of these ideas for the sponsors who are here of ways to think about balancing study conduct with compassion for participants. See some rotating staff, peer support. Okay, yeah, additional training, yep. Okay. So I'll speak to some of these ideas. I do think maybe it's obvious that all the ideas in the poll are options. Having it where the resources allow more than one team member who rotates on responsibilities can maintain those relationships as more professional. And I also think allows peer-to-peer emotional support in the context of some of the more challenging interactions with research subjects. I would also say that there is an opportunity to debrief on logistical and compliance related elements of executing a study protocol, but there's likewise a good reason to debrief on the emotional challenges with the team. And especially for studies that are a little bit larger, some of those emotional challenges will repeat themselves with different study subjects and across sites. So allowing staff to learn from one another on those experiences and then strategize how to answer to those for future interactions can be a helpful way to kind of crowdsource problem solving among research coordinators. And the sponsor does often get involved in this to talk about some of the challenges in executing this study, as do certainly the CRO teams. So rotating staff where resources allow, and then I would say from a leadership position, listening to the way the staff are speaking about the study and picking up on opportunities where it seems there is a breakdown of professional boundaries, watching for that and being mindful of it can allow us to intervene earlier and support staff who are signaling with their words that they might be having some challenges with those relationships and interactions. And just another reminder, again, that research staff who get extremely close to research participants may end up compromising some of the integrity of the trial if they, out of a personal relationship or an emotional relationship allow participants to skip doses or to miss visits. Ultimately, it's not to the benefit of research subjects or the trial at large to allow those types of compromises to occur. So even though in the moment that feels like an empathic decision, it does compromise everyone involved, as well as the ethics and the integrity of the trial. Okay, I think this is the last poll, and this one is going to be applicable to the CRAs at the talk, if there's any CRAs here, or CRO staff, probably sponsors as well. The monitor-coordinator relationship can be tenuous, and I'm wondering, for those who have seen the monitor-coordinator relationship degrade, what were some of the reasons for that? And maybe on the other piece during the Q&A, you guys can tell me about some things you've observed, but too many queries, I think, is a common one, or confusion on how to do the documentation. And then the MIA monitor and coordinator can always be a challenge as well. Okay, looks like the group here doesn't have a challenge with too many queries, so that's good.
Yeah.
People are doing their data entry well from the beginning. Okay, so yeah, I see the same thing with confusion on how to do the documentation, and then also the unfortunate MIA team member can definitely cause challenges. So I want to speak to each of these quickly, and for those who are newer to clinical trials, I'll just share that queries are the mechanism where we check and review the data that were entered by the site into the electronic data capture system. So the site staff will enter in the data, and then either a CRO team member or sometimes a sponsored team member called the monitor or the CRA will go through and review to ensure that the data entered are accurate. Sometimes that entails looking at source documentation to ensure that the data are correct as compared to the original instance, maybe in the Epic or another location for source data. But what can happen is that the monitors will query so much data in the database that coordinators can become frustrated. And advice for this one is just to implement monitoring quite early in the process. So you can catch some of these data entry issues early on and then ameliorate before a lot of different participants have an excess of incorrect data. Next one is confusion on how to document events. So it's the same recommendation here really is to monitor early and catch those points of confusion early, and then meet with all of the necessary stakeholders to ensure that they are all aligned on how data entry should be executed. And aligning among stakeholders is actually a compassionate effort as well as a compliance effort, because confusion for different players on how to do their work becomes frustrating, but also allows sites to implement consistently across different research centers. So we're running. I guess I've been talking a lot. We're going close to the 10 a.m. mark here on PST. So I'm going to move quickly through and try to leave at least 5 minutes for Q&A. I think I will just say that communication between coordinators and monitors is super important, and also across the whole web of research relationships. I would say that acknowledging one another's success is really important and allows improvements to morale and reduces burnout. And I challenge the audience to present other challenges between CRAs and coordinators so that we can talk about those in the Q&A. The same can happen with inaccessible participants, and I would encourage everybody that communication with participants is super honest as you move through your studies. I've seen in a lot of trials over-promising things to participants, whether it's over-promising on payment or over-promising on opportunities for open label, which is not ethical, but also leads to a lot of confusion and frustration, and ultimately can compromise the way the study is actually run because of the promises that aren't adhered to. You can have dropout and attrition because of those challenges. We spoke a little bit about decentralized trials. I would also just flag the opportunity for remote monitoring. So I'm going to flash through here just to save time for some questions. There's a lot of reasons why there's high staff turnover in clinical research. I've listed a bunch of them here. You guys will get the recording if you want to study some of those bullets a little bit more closely. And this is not even an exhaustive list here, but I will just flag some of the solutions for those, which is funding, which isn't always possible, but funding can make a big difference in reducing the burnout and staff turnover. Planning from the beginning for operational efficiency, which is that process of walking through the protocol and the tasks entailed, can make a big difference. And then a human-centered process and working with the team to incorporate concerns as you go. I'll pause on this one. I'll just bring it to the end here to say that clinical research is a highly regulated environment, but I would say a lot of what we spoke about today, the empathic considerations for study design through to execution, don't actually contradict compliance. They are to the benefit of compliance. And by considering complexity of the study and also considering the relationships that are entailed to make the trial happen, we'll end up with better data quality and better trial integrity and a more meaningful data set that comes out of it, as well as a better experience for everybody who's part of the research. So 3 minutes to spare, and I think Etienne and I have blocked through until 1/2 at 10:30 Pacific, so I can stay for another half hour, but for those who only had an hour, I wanted to at least give a moment for questions.
All right. Thank you so much. This was fantastic. You covered a lot of ground, and I loved how specific you got with your examples. That was really good. I'll just remind the audience, if you have a question, navigate to that Q&A tab. I'm going to look at that right now. But even if you don't have a question burning in your mind right now, go over there and go ahead and check those to see if any are applicable to you and upvote those questions that are most applicable. Okay. Let's see here. What's the most? So one is, this one comes from Nancy Mesas, if I'm saying your name correctly. The question is, could you share an example of a situation where compassion and compliance seemed to conflict and how that was resolved in a research setting?
I can definitely share examples of this one. So a recent example that I've had actually is we're running a study where a lot of the participants are socioeconomically challenged. We have a lot of homelessness, schizophrenic, difficult housing situations with our participants, and we're paying them a modest fee to participate in the trial. We require them to enroll for a brief period of time, and what we have found is that a lot of the participants are really in the study because of what's a quite modest payment. And a lot of our research coordinators, because these are really challenged participants, are invested in getting them on the study because the $25 from research participation makes a huge difference for them. And where the challenge comes in with compassion is our research coordinators, of course, interacting with these people, dozens of them a day in some cases, feel for them and their personal circumstances and want to get them on study and give them an opportunity because the participants are expressing that $25 makes a huge difference. And in a lot of cases, those individuals, for reasons entirely separate, don't qualify for the study, or they're not able to do the requirements for study participation. And if we do end up enrolling them anyway, that's a compliance issue because they don't meet the eligibility criteria. And what we've learned in cases where we didn't catch this early enough is if they did end up getting enrolled, we didn't end up actually collecting the required study data because they couldn't participate in the study. So compassion says, I'd like to enroll them because they've expressed that $25 is so meaningful, but the compliance element is that they're not eligible for the study. And I would say that ultimately compassion for those individuals is dismissing them of time that they're giving to the study before they get to that frustration moment where they couldn't do the study aims. The initial interaction dictated that compliance was giving them an opportunity to enroll, or the compassionate answer was giving them an opportunity to enroll, and it didn't pan out. So I would say enforcing the compliance in that challenging situation was a more important one at that time.
Okay, this is one I like just because I like books. Are there any strategies or guidance documents you recommend to refer when communicating to the staff to give hints how to regulate emotional challenges at the site?
Oh, interesting. Books or guidance documents. So I don't think that I have found guidance documents to be very helpful on human aspects of the research we do. So guidance documents don't come to mind really for me. Um, Books for communicating to staff on how to regulate emotional challenges at the site. That's a toughie, Sabine. If you want to message me on LinkedIn, I can think on that for longer and maybe get back to you. Um, for professional kind of softer concepts, I love Cal Newport and his books, but I'm not sure if Cal Newport gives specific hints on regulating emotional challenges. So I might have to take that one back and message me on LinkedIn if you want to correspond about that idea further.
And maybe turn it around to the audience too. If anybody out there has a recommendation, I'm always looking for once I get a book recommended 3 times, I feel like it's time to read it. So just from a product development standpoint, I always recommend Build, an Unorthodox Guide to Making Things Worth Making. I can't remember the author right now because I'm talking, but Benjamin asked the question, do you have any specific empathy tips and trips on the informed consent form specifically?
Yeah, I do actually. So informed consent is intended to really ensure that the participant knows what's going to be entailed in the study and that they feel confident that they can comply and that they understand benefits and risks of research participation. And I think the informed consent form classically is a lot of black and white text that's kind of dense, but developing potentially a PowerPoint or a colorful document that assists in the informed consent process can make that interaction a lot more accessible. You have to submit that to the IRB and get them to review and agree to the whatever ancillary document you might want to use during the informed consent process. But I do think having a secondary tool that assists in those conversations with participants, especially for studies that are complex, maybe visuals or flow diagrams to show them what it looks like to participate, and making it colorful can be a way to make that a more accessible conversation.
Awesome. Okay, and I'm not seeing anyone giving us any book advice in the chat, so I expect more from you all. So somebody's got some kind of recommendation, I'm sure. Let's see. Kelly asked the question, several of the points presented could be applied to high quality patient level surveys. However, since these are usually conducted by vendors and the participants are anonymous, are there still opportunities to incorporate compassion, empathy in these types of clinical activities?
Let me read the high quality patient level surveys, since these are conducted by vendors and participants are anonymous. Yeah, so I'm working on a decentralized trial right now where we have very few touch points. It's almost all via electronic platforms and different browsers and online tools. And I would say that there is still an opportunity to incorporate compassion in that context by having clarity of the interactions and making the flow through the study as seamless as possible. I think the study, one of the decentralized studies that I have worked on, there was a learning process in figuring out, even though it's entirely remote and we're not even involved because it's conducted by other organizations, still thinking through the workflow, even though it's online, and having clarity of the verbal instructions, or excuse me, the written instructions that they encounter is compassionate for them. The more confusing it is to participate and the more challenging it is to navigate some of the technologies or online platforms that they have to engage with, makes it less accessible for them and bringing it back to the thesis of the talk, it also hurts the compliance of the trial because you'll have more people who are lost to follow up because they can't figure out what you're asking of them.
Great answer. All right. Okay, I'm going to admit some ignorance here. So I would love to answer this question. Is there a way in Greenlight Guru Clinical to track shipped to participants? I am more of the quality side of things in product development, so I'm not familiar, and I don't know if you are or not. And I've got a message to my team, but if you don't have an answer, we'll get one to you.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I imagine you are talking about shipping IP to participants. I would say that it's definitely possible to create a case report form in which the team member who issues shipments could document those information. If these are data that are generated by the sponsor, I'm not sure if you would want to have a sponsor facing form in your EDC or if you might track that elsewhere, because typically the manufacturer will have their own documentation for shipping of materials. But I definitely think you could have some type of accountability log within the EDC for Greenlight Guru.
Thank you, and apologies that I don't have the answer. I guess that's I owe you $20 there. Okay.
Might be more to it, but yeah, maybe she can follow up with you on LinkedIn for that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Reach out. We'll try to get you connected to the team that can answer that question in a little more detail as well. But I thought my ignorance says I think it was a good answer. So, okay, Sabian asked the question, if I'm saying your name correctly, shouldn't it be described in the protocol or be integrated to collect interruption of the study to report? Sorry, I think I was grabbing a different question, but if you understand that one, feel free to answer. If not, feel free to punt.
I'm not sure what you meant by that, Sabine.
Okay. We're going to move on from that one, but if you want to clarify, feel free to go ahead and do that, and we'll try to come back to it. Okay, and I also need to keep track of time. I've got a lot of different things happening. It's a crazy week. What about, so see if you want to look at this one. Jan asked the question, what are the minimum requirements for clinical trial materials in terms of a new medical device to be part of a clinical trial of a new drug to be conducted in USA? So I assume this would be a combination product.
So what are the minimum requirements for clinical trial material for a medical device to be part of a clinical trial of a new drug? Yeah, so this is a tricky question, and it's going to depend on the specific device, but I've worked through this question on previous trials and have a couple of these now actually that we're working on. An example might be the delivery mechanism for a drug. So maybe you're developing a unique catheter, and that catheter is ultimately going to be delivering a new drug. In most cases, this would probably be submitted under an IND, but you would want to create a master file potentially of the information that's relevant to the medical device, depending on the relationship between you and the drug manufacturer. You could submit the medical device information within the IND or develop that information externally in a master file. But I would think of it the way you would need to prepare for a trial that's specifically on a medical device. So you would want to think about the risks entailed for the particular medical device, biocompatibility concerns, performance concerns, and test those prior to the submission to FDA to ensure that you don't have biocompatibility issues and that you're performing to the specifications that would be required for use in the trial. But there's no cut and dry black and white answer here because it really depends on what your product is and what it's intended to do in the study. But you do want to do sufficient testing to be able to present in the submission that it will be safe in this study. So I welcome you. This is always interesting on a case-by-case basis to think about these. Welcome you to message me to talk a little bit further about what you are specifically working on.
Very cool. Okay, I thought this was an interesting question from Gaiulia. Apologies if I have the name correctly. Empathy can be different in different cultures, especially trials run in other parts of the world. Do you have any advice on how to create alignment on a compassionate approach across study actors across cultures? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. And I would say different cultures in different parts of the world, and even within one country, site to site, there's different skill sets and viewpoints. Um, Ways to incorporate empathy and compassion, I would say, are to identify all the different sites that are going to be involved in a study and work with them as early as possible to get their take on what you're asking of them. And it might look different across different countries or different sites, but incorporating the viewpoints early on, allowing them to read the protocol before it's final, if there's an option for that, to understand how that can be implemented in their particular site and scenario. And then if that's not possible, which oftentimes it's not, especially for really large studies, giving them an opportunity to look at the database or the case report forms in advance can also allow them an opportunity to work through logistics that are specific to um, the medical infrastructure of their culture. Running studies in Europe versus the US looks really different in certain cases because the infrastructure is different. So giving sites an opportunity to do that earlier is better so that you can incorporate from the planning early on the uniqueness of different places where the study will be executed. Um, and then meeting regularly throughout study execution and hearing out the different experiences in different locations and assisting with that is another recommendation. Frequent communication.
Okay, great. And I thought of another book as it relates to this one. It's not medtech related, but the culture map is on my list to read, and it's highly recommended. So I'll throw that one out there just as a maybe we
Cool.
can do a book club later on that one deal. Yeah. If anyone's read that one, love to hear any thoughts. Good answer though. I think that's great. One last question. I'll make this the last question because none others have come in. Suzanne asked, what are the FDA's thoughts on remote or risk-based monitoring versus on-site monitoring, and are there differences in compassion and compliances between the monitoring functions?
Good question. So there is a movement toward risk-based monitoring. Um, the new revision of GCPs came out earlier this year, and we should be following those for European studies. I think the last I've understood was end of this month. So speaks a lot about the value and importance of risk-based monitoring. I would also say since the pandemic, remote monitoring has become more and more prevalent. So FDA is open to both of those, both remote monitoring as opposed to going on site, and then risk-based monitoring, which looks like potentially looking at eligibility criteria and key endpoints and safety, but not every single data point. Um, so this is okay, and there should be a monitoring plan that coincides with the intention behind risk-based monitoring and remote versus on-site monitoring. Um, Outside of FDA's opinion on these concepts, I would say that there are benefits to still doing some monitoring on site because relationships between the monitor and the site are really valuable. Sites I find enroll more quickly when they have face-to-face relationships with the CRO and the sponsor. Um, and second part of the question is, are there differences in compassion and compliance between the monitoring functions? And that's actually really interesting, Suzanne, because um, there's less room for compassion in the monitoring function. I think it's pretty rigid for monitors in terms of the review of the compliance elements of the study. I will say where compassion comes in for monitoring is the interaction between the monitor and the research coordinator and the site. I think in some cases, the monitor coordinator relationship can be very friendly and collaborative, and in other cases, the monitor and coordinator relationship um, can be met with superiority kind of um, lens, and the opportunity for the monitor to show compassion toward the coordinator for the chaotic environment they work in and all of the pressure on them to enroll quickly and the volume of data entry um, is an important piece for the monitor to implement their compassion.
Great. I just got a question for in the chat about books on design controls, and I was trying to think of one.
Books
I don't
on
know if you,
design controls.
that one
Um,
specifically, I don't know if I have a good one, honestly.
I don't know if I have a good one either. Books on design controls. This is one where I might have pointed you more toward guidance because there's FDA guidance that you can read. Um, I'll have to
Honestly,
take it away with the books. I don't engage with books very much in a professional side of things, which is sad to say, but
you're probably more
um,
interesting in real life that way, so it's okay. Because I've had the opposite problem. So, what I would say, I still recommend Build. I think it's Tony Fadell is the author. He actually started at General Magic, then went to Apple, then he started Google Nest. Before it was Google, it was Nest. Anyway, he's very prolific, and the reason I recommend that, even though it's not necessarily design controls, do the design controls is the regulatory aspect. Um, Really, design controls is just good engineering practice. So if you learn that and learn how to make a good product, then you apply the regulatory onto it to frame it up. But there needs to be a book. So something's out there. Anyway, going off on a different tangent. Megan, I think you might have set a record, although we might have done this last time as well. I don't know. For some reason, either we're not getting as many questions or you're just really plowing through them. You answered a lot of questions and we don't have any other questions at the moment. So really hats off to you for handling all of the questions we threw at you. Really good, uh, very impressive job. I'm impressed. I'll give, since we do have a few minutes, I'll give the audience one more second to answer any questions or ask any questions if you have them. Or Megan, do you have any last thoughts you want to share with the audience?
Um, last thoughts. Let's see. I'll just say if you guys have any questions that are more specific to exactly the product that you're working on, I would welcome questions that are more specific on LinkedIn, or you can email me. But I am always interested to hear from what folks are working on and think about some of the unique questions. So happy to apply these concepts to more specific ideas if you guys do have them.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Megan. Really appreciate the
Thank
informative
you. It was
presentation, all
great.
the insights. Those of you been listening, as a reminder, we will be sending out today's recording and the presentation slides, so keep an eye out for that. And on behalf of Greenlight Guru, thank you all for attending today's webinar and have a great rest of your day. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Take care.